Hello, and welcome again, everyone, to We the Podcast, where we examine the structure of the Constitution and measure modern government against the original design. This show isn't about left versus right, it is about the constitutional structure of our government. Each episode asks whether our government institutions are operating the way the Constitution requires and whether the balance of power still reflects the framework that our founding fathers had established. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that both major parties in the United States are deeply uncomfortable confronting because it forces us to examine how power actually grows inside the American presidency. If you spend any time listening to political debate today, you will often hear critics accuse Donald Trump of abusing presidential power. And almost immediately, one of the most common responses from his supporters is very simple: Obama did it. Most Democrats dismiss that argument out of hand. They treat it as deflection, a way of avoiding responsibility for what Trump himself has done. But if we slow down and examine the structure of the problem instead of the partisan fight surrounding it, that phrase actually points to something much deeper. Because in many cases, the powers that Donald Trump has used were not invented by him, they were inherited by him. They were developed gradually over time by previous administrations that expanded the scope of presidential authority. And when those expansions occurred, the political party that benefited from them very often refused to confront them honestly. The result is that when the opposition eventually comes to power, it inherits the same expanded authority and uses it to force through its own agenda, often to the direct detriment of the very people who originally justified the expansion. That is where the real danger begins. When a political movement refuses to hold its own leaders accountable to the Constitution and the overreach for the cause of expediency, those actions do not simply disappear once the administration ends. They become a precedent. And once a precedent exists, the next administration rarely stops to ask whether that power should exist at all. The next president simply assumes it is now part of the office and proceeds to use it. And if that administration, the new administration, does not actively work to roll those powers back, they become entrenched, ready for every future president to inherit and to abuse. That is how presidential power expands in modern American government. It rarely happens all at once. During COVID-19, we saw many executive expansions, but that's not the topic today. It happens gradually, one administration at a time. One expansion is justified as necessary in the moment. A later administration then points to that precedent and claims the same authority for its own purposes. The next expansion is defended the same way, by pointing to the one that came before it, and that it is necessary for this time. By the time political power changes hands, the constitutional boundary that once existed has been shifted. What begins as an exception becomes normal practice. What once required congressional authorization becomes something the executive branch simply assumes it can do. This is where the title of tonight's episode comes into play. We have what I call an accountability vacuum. An accountability vacuum forms when political parties stop enforcing constitutional limits against their own side. The restraints that are supposed to exist inside the system begin to disappear as the people sworn to defend those limits simply stop enforcing them. Once those restraints disappear, the presidency itself becomes more powerful with every administration. Tonight, we're going to examine how that process played out during the Obama administration, particularly in the area of executive powers, executive overreach, and war powers. We will look at how those precedents created new tools inside the presidency, tools that President Trump later inherited and used himself. And finally, we are going to talk about why Republicans should be very careful about defending those same expansions of power today. History shows a very predictable pattern in American politics. The pendulum always swings. Parties rise, parties fall, and the opposition eventually returns to power. When that happens, every authority expanded by the previous administration is still sitting there, waiting to be used by the next one. Our founding fathers understood this danger. As Thomas Jefferson warned when speaking about political power, he said that in questions of power, then let no more be heard of the confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. The constitutional system only works when those in power are willing to restrain their own side. When political parties stop doing that, the safeguards that Madison, Jefferson, and so many other of our founding fathers described begin to fail. If those chains are ignored or unshackled for the sake of short-term political victories, they will eventually become long-term political losses. The chains do not magically reappear when the other side takes office. The same powers justified today will simply be waiting on the desk for the next president tomorrow. So before we dive into the bulk of this episode, if you appreciate conversations like these and the focus on Constitution rather than partisan talking points, please make sure to like this video, subscribe, leave a comment below. Your engagement helps this content reach more people who care about constitutional government. And if you want to dive deeper into many of these ideas that we're discussing, check out my book, The Last Republican, Thomas Massie and the Death of a Party. The links are in the description below. If you find value, consider sharing this with someone else who cares about the Constitution and the future of our republic. So to dive in, to understand the presidency of that Donald Trump inherited, we have to begin with the precedent set during the Obama administration. For many conservatives, this was one of the most frustrating periods in modern constitutional politics. Not simply because the policies themselves, but because of the method used to impose them. During the Obama years, the executive branch increasingly adopted what many critics described as rule by executive order mentality. When Congress would not pass legislation, the administration would often look for other ways to accomplish the same goals through executive action, regulatory authority, or creative interpretations of existing laws. The most famous expression of this mentality came from President Barack Obama himself during a meeting with Democratic lawmakers on January 14th, 2014. While discussing executive actions he intended to pursue without waiting for Congress, Obama stated, "We're not going to just wait for legislation in order to make sure that we are providing Americans the kind of help that they need. I've got a pen and I'm willing to use it." For many Americans, particularly constitutional conservatives, this raised serious concerns because under the Constitution, the president does not write law. Congress does. But the issue went far beyond domestic policy. The most serious constitutional concerns came in the area of war powers. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, the power to declare war belongs to Congress. The president serves as commander-in-chief, but the authority to initiate war was deliberately placed in the legislative branch so that no one single person could drag the nation into military conflict. Yet during the Obama administration, the United States carried out military operations and airstrikes in multiple countries without any kind of congressional authorization, including in Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan, off the top of my head. The Libya intervention in 2011 became the clearest example of constitutional conflict. When members of Congress raised concerns under the War Powers Resolution, the administration argued that the bombing campaign did not qualify as hostilities in the legal sense, an interpretation that many constitutional scholars found extremely difficult to accept. The United States was clearly conducting sustained airstrikes, yet Congress never authorized any war or conflict. For many Republicans and constitutional conservatives, this represented a dangerous expansion of presidential power. But instead of confronting that expansion of power honestly, most Democrats defended it. That was the moment that the accountability vacuum began to form and hyper-partisan politics filled the void. Because once a party refuses to hold its own president accountable for constitutional overreach, the precedent does not disappear. It becomes a part of the presidency itself. The war powers issue was only one of the much larger expansions of executive authority during the Obama administration. The broader shift was the growing belief that when Congress refuses to act, the executive branch could simply move forward on its own. For many Americans watching this unfold at the time, it felt like a fundamental change in how national policy was being made. Instead of legislation being debated, negotiated, and passed through Congress, more and more policy decisions were coming directly from the executive branch through executive orders, regulatory directives, and administrative rulemaking. The Obama administration relied heavily on executive orders and administrative agencies to accomplish their goals. When Congress would not pass legislation, Obama ruled by the pen. Major regulatory initiatives on healthcare implementation, environmental policy, immigration enforcement priorities, and labor laws were often advanced through federal agencies rather than through new laws passed by Congress. In theory, these actions were justified as using existing statutory authority. But in practice, they represented a rapid expansion in how aggressively the executive branch interpreted that authority. Critics argued that the presidency was no longer simply executing laws, but increasingly shaping national policy on its own. This was especially visible in areas like immigration policy, environmental regulation, and labor laws, where federal agencies issued sweeping rules that dramatically changed policy without Congress passing new legislation. At the time, many conservatives warned that these expansions of executive authority were extremely dangerous, not because of the policies themselves, but because of the precedent they created. Once the executive branch claims the authority to reshape major areas of policy without Congress, the authority doesn't disappear. And that's exactly what happened when Donald Trump entered office. Trump inherited the same administrative machinery, the same executive tools, the same precedents that had been expanded under Obama, but he used them in very different ways. Many environmental regulations were reversed through executive authority. Immigration enforcement policies were dramatically shifted through executive directives. Regulatory agencies were instructed to dismantle rules that previous administrations had created. The same executive tools that had been used to expand government policy were now being used to reverse it. And to be clear, many of those reversals were good policy decisions. Conservatives had spent years arguing that many of those regulations created during the Obama administration should never have been imposed in the first place. When Trump reversed them, many Republicans were relieved to see those policies undone. But that is not the constitutional point. The problem is that the power itself remained. And because these actions were taken through executive authority rather than legislation, they could be reversed just as quickly by the next administration. Another perfect example of this is the Keystone and Dakota Access pipelines. They provide a perfect example of this. The Trump administration approved them through executive authority. But when President Biden took office, those approvals were blocked through the same executive authority. The policy outcome changed, but the structural problem remained exactly the same. This is one of the dangers of concentrating so much policy-making authority into the presidency. When the executive branch becomes the primary engine of policy change, the country becomes vulnerable to rapid swings in national policy every time the White House changes hands. Policies created by executive action can be undone by executive action. That means every 4 years, the direction of the federal government can change dramatically depending on who occupies the Oval Office. That kind of instability is exactly what the Constitution's legislative process was designed to prevent. Our founding fathers intentionally made legislation slow, difficult, and deliberative so that the national policy would reflect broad and durable political consensus. Executive rulemaking bypasses that process. And when that becomes the normal way of policy, the presidency itself becomes the center of political power. So I touched a little bit on war powers earlier, and I'm going to touch on that again now, but a little more in depth. The expansion of executive authority becomes even more serious when we look at the issue of war powers. Under the Constitution, the authority to declare war belongs to Congress, as I mentioned earlier. The president serves as the commander-in-chief. The founding fathers did not give these powers on accident. They delegated them separately on purpose. They believed that the power to send the nation into war should rest in the hands of the legislature, not a single individual. James Madison warned about this in his writing in 1793. He said, "The executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war to the legislature." That is precisely why the Constitution gives the authority to Congress rather than the presidency. But over time, that structure has slowly eroded. Presidents from both parties have increasingly initiated military operations without formal congressional declaration of war. Many critics will point out that even earlier conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan did not have formal declarations of war. That is technically true, but there is one important constitutional distinction that has often been ignored in these modern debates. Both of those conflicts were authorized by Congress through authorizations for use of military force, or AMFs for short. This is required by the War Powers Resolution passed in 1973. Congress debated those conflicts, voted on them, and formally granted President Bush authority to conduct military operations. Whether one agrees with those wars or not, the constitutional structure still involved congressional authorization. That is a very different situation from unilateral military operations conducted without either a declaration of war or an AUMF. What once required a national debate and a congressional vote has gradually been replaced with unilateral executive action. The Obama administration accelerated that trend. During the Obama years, Democrats were especially guilty of blurring this distinction. Critics who raised constitutional concerns were often told that previous presidents had used military force without a declaration of war. But that comparison ignores the key note that I just referenced. Those earlier conflicts did have some form of congressional authorization attached to them. By defending unilateral military actions without Congress, many Democrats helped normalize the very precedent that would later be used by Trump and despised by those very same Democrats. Military actions were conducted across multiple theaters without congressional authorization. And Libya became that most controversial example when Congress questioned the legality of the operation. When Congress questioned the legality of the operation under the War Powers Resolution. The administration argued that the sustained bombing campaign did not qualify as hostilities. The interpretation allowed the administration to bypass congressional authorization entirely just based on their own definition. Many constitutional scholars across the political spectrum criticized that reasoning. But the operation continued, and the precedent remained. And once that precedent exists, as I've said over and over already, the next administration inherits it. And that's exactly what happened with President Trump. Trump now has ordered military strikes and operations in several countries without congressional authorization, including Iran twice, Nigeria, and Venezuela. The constitutional structure has not changed. Congress still has the power on paper, but in practice, the president has already expanded its authority. Trump did not create that expansion. He is simply using it. And that is exactly how constitutional boundaries move over time. One administration stretches the limit. The next administration treats that stretch as normal practice. And this is where the problem becomes impossible to ignore. When President Obama expanded executive war powers, most Democrats defended it. When President Biden attempted sweeping economic policies through executive authorization, Democrats defended that as well. But when Donald Trump uses those same tools, Democrats suddenly rediscover their constitutional limits. By that point, however, the precedent has already been established. Republicans began arguing that very precedent. If Obama and Biden can do it, so can we. And that is the accountability vacuum. The very same Republicans that once criticized Obama and Biden accepted that very same action to justify their own abuses. Power once given does not go away. Any accountability vacuum, when a political party refuses to enforce constitutional limits against its own leaders while they are in power, the guardrails of the system that are in place, still written into the Constitution, but the people responsible for defending them choose not to apply them. That's why the accountability vacuum is so important to end. The results are predictable. Every administration will push that boundary a little bit further, knowing that their own political allies are going to defend it. And that's that pendulum. It may start swinging like this, but it'll start getting bigger and bigger as each side pulls harder and harder. And now we have the extremities on both sides arguing with each other about the limitations and why it's acceptable for my side to do it, but not your side. The opposition complains while they're not in power. But when the opposition eventually returns to power and inherits those same tools, it uses the very powers that it complained about. At that point, the original defenders of those powers suddenly want constitutional restraints again. But by then, it's too late because the constitutional limits are not self enforcing. They only survive when political actors are willing to enforce them, even when they are the ones in power. When that discipline disappears, the presidency begins to accumulate power with every administration. One president expands the boundary, the next treats it as normal. The president after that expands it again, and over time, the office itself becomes something very different from what the Constitution originally designed. This is why the accountability vacuum is so dangerous. It removes the internal restraint that the constitutional system depends on. Instead of ambition counteracting ambition, party loyalty begins protecting power. And once that happens, the expansion of presidential authority becomes almost automatic. Every administration inherits more power than the last. At this point, for any Democrats that may be listening to this conversation, you might be thinking something very simple. You despise Donald Trump. You despise his rhetoric, his behavior, and the way he uses the presidency. But there's an uncomfortable reality that Democrats have to confront. If we are going to have an honest conversation about constitutional structure, modern Democrats helped create the conditions that made a presidency like Trump's possible. When executive authority was expanded during the Obama years, many Democrats defended those expansions because they supported their policy goals. When critics raised constitutional concerns, those concerns were dismissed as partisan attacks. Those expansions did not disappear when Obama left office. They remained inside the presidency itself. That meant those very powers that Democrats had pushed for were now in the hands of Donald Trump when he entered office. He inherited a presidency that already possessed far more unilateral authority than the Constitution originally intended. When Democrats were defending executive overreach, many of their arguments were, oh, the Constitution's so old. It's an ancient document. It has no bearing on modern politics. Well, now you see why it does. This is the lesson that Democrats must confront moving forward. If Democrats truly want to prevent another presidency like Donald Trump's from emerging in the future, they cannot simply oppose the person of Donald Trump. They cannot simply reverse his policies. They must restore constitutional limits that restrain the office itself. That means holding your own leaders accountable when those leaders execute authority that does not belong to them. It means rejecting unconstitutional power even when it advances policies that you support. The American system was never designed to give a single person enough authority to reshape the country alone. The United States was built on a system of limited government. Power was intentionally divided so that no single office would have enough authority to abuse it. Government officials were meant to have just enough power to manage the government, not enough power to dominate it. So again, if Democrats want to prevent the rise of another presidency like President Trump's, restoring the constitutional balance must begin with their own willingness to enforce limits on their own side. And this is where that same lesson becomes very important to Republicans, because the exact same temptation exists right now for Republicans. When President Trump expands presidential authority, many Republicans rush to his defense. They rush to defend it because they support the policy goals. But that is exactly the same mistake that Democrats made. If Republicans refuse to enforce constitutional limits on their own side, the cycle will continue. That pendulum will continue to swing further and further out of alignment. Eventually, Democrats will return to power. When they do, every power used today will still be sitting on the desk for the next president. Every executive power, every expansion of presidential power, every justification used to bypass Congress is going to be used by the Democrats in the same way, and the pendulum will swing further. Animosity will grow between the parties. And those same powers will be used to dismantle everything that Donald Trump has accomplished, for better or for worse. Then, those powers will be used to push a new agenda, expanding the system even further. That is how the cycle continues. And if Republicans truly want to hold Democrats accountable, there is only one way to do it. We must first be willing to hold ourselves accountable. Constitutional limits only have meaning when they apply to everyone, including your own side. If Republicans continue to attack fellow conservatives, constitutionalists, libertarians, independents, and swing voters simply for insisting on constitutional accountability, that will destroy the very coalition that made the modern conservative movement possible. Alienating those voices will fracture the base that helped elect Donald Trump in the first place. And if that coalition collapses, the consequences will not last only one election cycle. It could set both the conservative movement and the broader cause of constitutionalism back decades. That means that the real question Republicans must answer is very simple. Do we want short-term political victories, or do we want to restore the constitutional structure that protects the country in the long run? Because if we fail to enforce those limits ourselves, the next administration will enforce its own agenda with the same powers, and the cycle will begin again. The Constitution only works when Americans are willing to hold their own side accountable, not just the opposition, your own party. Because the moment that standard becomes it's acceptable when my side does it, constitutional limits disappear. And once those limits disappear, every administration inherits a presidency with fewer restraints than the one before. And that is the accountability vacuum. It is not created by one president. It is created when people who should defend constitutional limits decide those limits are optional when their side is in power. If Republicans truly want to restore constitutional government, the responsibility begins with us. We must be willing to defend the Constitution even when it restrains our own side. Because if we refuse to do that, the next administration will abuse the powers that we did not restrain. They will use it, and they will destroy and dismantle everything that we are trying to accomplish, not to preserve what we have built. The only way to stop it is to close the accountability vacuum, not with rhetoric, not with partisan outrage, but with constitutional discipline. Because the Constitution was never designed to protect one party from the other. It was designed to protect the American people from the concentration of power itself. If we truly care about preserving this republic, that is the standard that we must be willing to enforce on everyone, including ourselves. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. If you found this discussion valuable, like I said, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. Let us know anything you learned. Let us know anything you found interesting. Tell us where you're watching from. Anything. Your engagement helps this show grow and reach more people that care about the Constitution and the structure of government. And if you believe these conversations matter, please share this episode with someone else who also believes these conversations matter.